My name is Will Pomerantz, and I'm Deputy Director here at the Kennan Institute. And on behalf of Jane Harmon, the President, Director, and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center, and Blair Rubel, the Director of the Kennan Institute, I would like to welcome everyone today to our conference on the road taken 20 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. The Kennan Institute is pleased to co-host this event today with the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University. Anniversaries always call for a moment of reflection, especially when they involve such historic and unexpected developments as the collapse of the Soviet Union. For those of us who lived through these remarkable times, we remember the passionate debates that occurred about the various paths forward, and all of which contained their promises and challenges. In many ways, those debates remain as fresh today as they were 20 years ago, and still define how many of us look at the region. For a new generation, however, who has no first-hand memory of the USSR, basically anyone under the age of 25, this anniversary is less about debating choices that were made long ago, as opposed to trying to make sense of a transition that is, in many ways, still in search of an endpoint. Thus, by using this anniversary to explore the road taken, we can again look backwards to better understand the options that presented themselves at the end of the Soviet period, and also look at the region afresh in light of the road traveled over the past 20 years. Such a conference does not take place without a lot of help. I would first like to thank Professor Angela Stent, who originally approached the Kennan Institute with the idea of co-hosting this event, and has done a tremendous amount of work in terms of recruiting the speakers and organizing the panels. I would also like to thank Jennifer Long, the Associate Director of Series, and Eugene Imus for all their help in organizing the event. And finally, Joe Dressen from the Kennan Institute also provided invaluable assistance in the preparation for this conference. Two quick administrative matters. First, I ask that everyone please turn off their cell phones and other electronic devices. They do interfere with our sound system, so please turn them off. And in addition, you were handed a Kennan Institute seminar exit survey. We'd be most appreciative if you could fill that out at the end of this panel. And with that, I'm going to turn the events over to Angela Stent.
Thank you, Will. I'd like to join Will in welcoming everyone here. I'd also like to thank the Kennan Institute, Will, the director, Blair Rubel, and all the staff here who've helped make this possible. And I would also like to thank Chevron for their support for this conference. We have a very distinguished first panel today, and I'm looking forward very much to their remarks to talk about what our expectations were when the Soviet Union collapsed, and explain why those expectations have or have not been borne out. Last Friday, a group of us had dinner with Vladimir Putin at an equestrian club outside of Moscow. And he said, as he has on many occasions, that he saved Russia from collapsing, from disintegration in 1999, and then he emphasized again, change is slow. It happens and it will happen, but it is very slow and gradual. That, of course, has been the mantra of supporters of the system that has developed in Russia over the last decade. But the question is, could a different road have been taken as we look back on the past 20 years? And that's why I look forward very much to our panel's thoughts on this. And indeed, our first speaker's, the title of his talk is going to be The Road Not Taken. So you, of course, know all of these panelists very well. I will give them shorter introductions so we have more time for discussion. Our first speaker will be Professor Archie Brown. He's Emeritus Professor of Politics at Oxford University and an Emeritus Fellow of St. Antony's College, Oxford. He is, of course, a prolific author. I think he's written 18 books, and his latest book, which has just come out here, right, is The Rise and Fall of Communism. We look forward very much to your remarks.
Thanks so much. Well, thank you very much. When I saw the overall title, The Road Taken, it just gave me very easily my title, The Road Not Taken. The subtitle is Gorbachev's Alternative Vision. In most of the successor states of the Soviet Union, there is less vibrant political pluralism and less enthusiasm for democracy than there was in the final years of the Soviet Union. The Baltic states are, of course, the main exception to that generalization. Russia is not an exception. Election results were less preordained even in 1989 and certainly in 1990 and 1991 than they are now. In the last 3 Soviet years, all Union and Russian elections were for legislatures that were more politically influential and more independent than is the contemporary Russian State Duma. Even in 1989, the chairman of the Council of Ministers, Ryzhkov, had 9 of his nominations for ministerial posts rejected by the legislature. And it's quite impossible to imagine that happening today. The last 20 years in Russia, whether during the Yeltsin presidency or since then, do not represent a continuation of perestroika. They have reflected a sharp break with the social democratic conception of socialism, which was the culminating point of the evolution of Mikhail Gorbachev's ideas, as well as of some of his key advisors, notably Georgy Shakhnazarov, his principal aide on political reform. There were many different ideational strands in late Soviet Russia, as well as rapidly expanding and mutating economic interests. And interests were to trump ideas in the 1990s. Russia has had a weak to non-existent tradition of social democracy in the West European and Scandinavian type. The Mensheviks or the SRs might have developed into social democratic parties, but their forcible repression by the Bolsheviks meant that they were given no such opportunity. Nevertheless, in the last years of the Soviet Union, the most reliable survey evidence would suggest that there was a potential constituency for what may reasonably be called social democracy. By that I mean fair and free elections, accountability of politicians, and support for a welfare state. Support also for a mixed ownership economy, state, cooperative and private, although there was a lot of popular suspicion of private profiteering. There was similar support for a market economy, albeit one regulated by the state. There was already in the last years of the Soviet Union growing opposition to the widening of inequality, though the inequality then was as nothing compared with what has happened since the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Moreover, the growing support for Boris Yeltsin in the last years of the Soviet Union owed much to his espousal of apparently egalitarian views. Although they were not worked out in an intellectually coherent way, they seemed closer to social democracy than to the corrupt capitalism and extremes of inequality over which he presided in the 1990s. A London courtroom is currently providing interesting evidence on how much money Abramovich deemed it prudent to pay Berezovsky for his influence over Yeltsin's decisions. Alexander Lukin published a perceptive and well-researched study of the belief system of Russian democratic activists during perestroika called The Political Culture of the Russian Democrats. This is what he says about Yeltsin's beliefs and political statements in the period before the August 1991 coup. While from 1988 to 91 Yeltsin's beliefs were democratic, they were closer to the communitarian social justice type than to radical market libertarianism. In his speeches at the time, he laid much greater stress on the problems of justice and calling for abolition of privileges, raising living standards, and giving more money to medicine, science, and education at the expense of military spending and foreign aid. He never mentioned anything like shock therapy or the privatization of heavy industry. That's a quote from Lukin. Well, against that, I would add that Yeltsin did, of course, give his unequivocal support to the 500 days program for transition to the market produced by the Shetalin-Yavlinsky team in 1990, although he claimed that things would be tough for 6 months and then it would be better for everybody. He projected an image of someone who believed in greater equality, even though his rhetorical support for both egalitarianism and the liberalism of the 500 days program was not really intellectually consistent. In the post-Soviet era, Yeltsin was sustained by the loans for shares for votes process, in which Russia's mineral wealth was handed over to pre-selected buyers at knockdown prices, and their financial and media power was then used to turn around the 1996 election from a time early in the year when it looked like such a lost cause that Yeltsin came very close to cancelling that presidential election. Now, that would have been a full retreat not only from Yeltsin's late Soviet inchoate support for a kind of social democracy, but a retreat from democracy per se. Gorbachev, in contrast, moved quite rapidly and more consistently in the second half of the 1980s from being a reformist communist to becoming a socialist of a social democratic type. He also saw much to be admired in the German social market economy, which was supported both by Christian Democrats and Social Democrats. Of course, Yegor Gaidar was partly right when he said that Russia was in such an economic crisis in 1990-91 that it didn't have the luxury of choosing between a variety of economic models, whether American, German, or Swedish. Gaidar was entirely wrong, however, in producing in his book Collapse of an Empire an economic determinist account of Gorbachev, in which everything the last Soviet leader did, from introducing pluralizing political reform at home to allowing the countries of East Central Europe to become independent and non-communist, was governed by a desperate desire for Western economic aid. He never explains why, if Gorbachev was as concerned with the Soviet Union's economic plight as Gaidar thinks he must have been, the last Soviet leader gave priority to political over economic reform. Indeed, Gorbachev himself, writing earlier this year in the New York Times on the 25th anniversary of the launch of Perestroika in March this year, wrote, "In the heat of political battles, we lost sight of the economy, and people never forgave us for the shortages of everyday items and the lines for essential goods." The fact is that as the new tolerance, the glasnost which quite rapidly developed into freedom of speech and publication, and the advent of competitive elections brought all the suppressed grievances and repressed demands of 70 years to the surface of political life, Gorbachev's strategy of revolutionary change by evolutionary means became virtually impossible to implement. While his role in changing the Soviet political system was decisive in the first 4 years of Perestroika, by 1990-91, events were out of his control. However, I just want to summarize briefly, in the remaining time, the alternative he was articulating, an alternative both to the crony capitalism and deeply flawed democracy of the 1990s, and to the crony capitalism cum state corporatism and creeping authoritarianism of the 21st century. Gorbachev did have an ideational alternative to what we have seen in the last 20 years. Whether it was a realistic political alternative must be a matter for debate. It would be wrong to try to identify an instant when Gorbachev ceased to be a communist and became a socialist of a social democratic type, for there was never a road to Damascus moment. And there's a contrast here with Boris Yeltsin. The moment when Yeltsin stopped being a communist was when he saw an American supermarket for the first time. Gorbachev was a more cerebral politician. Western consumerists' achievements on their own were not enough to lead Gorbachev to abandon ideas derived from Marx and Lenin with which he had grown up and upon which he had reflected more seriously than did most of his Soviet contemporaries. However, already at the 27th Party Congress in February 1986, Gorbachev called for a reconsideration of the Communist Party's relations with social democracy. At that time, he spoke about the differences between them still being deep, but said if they were better acquainted with each other's positions, this would undoubtedly be useful both for communists and for social democrats. Deputy head of the International Department of the Central Committee, Karen Brutens, wrote that from the outset of Perestroika, there was on the Soviet side a new interest in learning from the experience of social democracy, adding, Gorbachev and his associates strove in an unbiased way to examine the practice of Western countries in general and of social democracy in particular. Gorbachev's favourite foreign interlocutors, even though he got on well enough with Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, George Bush, his favourite foreign interlocutors were the Spanish Socialist Prime Minister Felipe González and the former West German Chancellor Willy Brandt, who by that time was president of the Socialist International, the organisation of socialist parties of a social democratic type in Western Europe. With González in particular, Gorbachev had discussions on the meaning of socialism. And in a conversation with him in Madrid on the 27th of October 1990, Gorbachev told González that the positive example of Spain's transition from authoritarian rule was especially important for us. What matters for the Soviet Union, he said, is the Spanish experience of constructing democracy and new forms of economic life. Gorbachev was already moving away from a communist model of socialism in 1987, and he encountered resistance in the Politburo in that year when the draft of the speech he'd prepared for the 70th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution was watered down. At the Politburo meeting on the 15th of October 1987, several members objected not only to his positive references to what he called socialist pluralism, but also to the statement that an authoritarian bureaucratic model of socialism had been built in the Soviet Union. When the KGB chairman Viktor Chebrikov said that this was a Western formula, Gorbachev claimed that Bukharin had said this before anyone in the West. Typically, however, he made a tactical retreat, saying that model was perhaps not the best word and should be replaced by methods or means. And this was characteristically one step back before moving 2 steps forward shortly thereafter. Condemnation of the model of socialism that had been built in the Soviet Union would soon reappear with a vengeance. In a meeting with regional party secretaries on the 18th of April 1988, one of a series Gorbachev held in order to prepare them for the 19th Party Conference that year, he said the question was posed, and not only in the West, on what basis do 20 million rule 200 million? At the time, of course, party membership stood at just under 20 million. Gorbachev supplied the answer, saying, "We conferred on ourselves the right to rule the people." The move to contested elections approved at the 19th Conference and implemented in March 1989, though the elections were still not fully free, marked a qualitative difference in Soviet political life, especially since they introduced competition for a legislature with real power and influence, unlike the pre-existing Supreme Soviet. Especially important was the fact that party members could compete against one another on fundamentally different policy platforms. This meant that the sacred doctrine of democratic centralism had been confined to the ashcan of history. The term democratic socialism, not democratic centralism, democratic socialism had always been rejected by communist leaders and ideologists, although they spoke happily about the socialist democracy they claimed to have constructed. Democratic socialism was the language of socialists of a social democratic type who used it to distinguish themselves from undemocratic socialists, otherwise known as communists. Therefore, when Gorbachev embraced the language of democratic socialism, as he did from 1989, this was a very significant ideological innovation on the part of the General Secretary. In a Pravda article that year, after noting that democratic socialism had been given a negative evaluation in the Soviet Union, he said that such a characterization made no sense at a time when the development of democracy was going hand in hand with the construction of a state based on the rule of law, and given that democracy and freedom were the great values of human civilization. In a large declaratory article with Gorbachev's imprimatur published in Pravda following the 28th Party Congress in 1990, called Toward a Humane Democratic Socialism, it was accepted that the country was in crisis. This, however, the article contended, was not a crisis of socialism, but one which arose out of the deformations of socialism. These included the statization of all aspects of social life, dictatorship, the creation of new forms of alienation of people from property and power, and a view of the world as an arena of irreconcilable confrontation of social systems. As Vadim Medvedev, one of Gorbachev's main allies on the Politburo, later noted, this party declaration, both in spirit and in letter, differed from every party document that had preceded it, being written in what he called a social democratic tone. The last document I'll cite is the draft party program, which was published unofficially in July 1991. And many in the party apparatus had no intention of implementing it. Society had moved on, and so not much attention was actually paid to it. And it was to become almost immediately irrelevant made irrelevant by the course of political events. The abortive coup occurred the following month, and the Soviet Union itself had ceased to exist by the end of the year. The document has therefore not received all that much subsequent attention. It did, however, reflect the evolution of Gorbachev's thinking during perestroika. It's important to recall what he argued and endorsed at the time, rather than simply rely on what he's written and said in more recent years, although most of that is congruent with his views in the last years of the Soviet Union. Even at a time when he was engaged in an epic struggle to hold a renewed union together on the basis of a new and voluntary union treaty, Gorbachev devoted a lot of time to the content of this program. He sidelined the Politburo completely and relied on Shakhnazarov and Ivan Frolov to produce a social democratic document that would pave the way for what Shakhnazarov called a civilized divorce within the CPSU. The intention was that the party would split and that Gorbachev would head the social democratic component, which might attract several million members. The draft program embraced a multi-party polity, the separation of powers, transition to a mixed ownership system and a regulated market economy, transition to the rule of law, and to working exclusively within what they called the framework of parliamentary democracy. The program also stated that the party had broken forever with the principle that the end justifies the means. In his speech to the Central Committee commending the draft, Gorbachev said that the previous theoretical and practical model of socialism had proved to be bankrupt, and that so far as the economy was concerned, socialism and the market were not only compatible, but indivisible in essence. A final word. Gorbachev's continuing commitment to what he called socialism was construed by many at home and abroad as meaning that he had not changed his basic beliefs. But communist and social democratic conceptions of socialism were and are different in kind. The evolution of Gorbachev's thinking was matched by institutional power for long enough to change fundamentally the Soviet Union's political system, its ideational basis, and its relations with the outside world. In the end, however, ill understood as they were, Gorbachev's evolving beliefs did not take hold in a country with no tradition of social democracy in the West European sense. They represented a road not taken. Gorbachev's ideas and aspirations were outflanked by the market fundamentalism and political impatience of his radical opponents, and frustrated by the implacable enmity of conservative defenders of the vanishing Communist Party state. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope we can get back to the question of why 20 years later social democratic ideas don't seem to have much support among the population of the Russian Federation. Our next speaker is Ambassador Jack Matlock, who has had, of course, a very distinguished diplomatic career. He was the ambassador to the Soviet Union from 1997 to August 1991, a very exciting time. He's a former George F. Kennan professor in the School of Historical Studies in the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton. He has also taught at Columbia. He is the author of a number of books, including probably the most famous one, Autopsy on an Empire, the American Ambassador's Account of the Collapse of the Soviet Union, which, of course, was a prize-winning book. So we look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much for those kind words. When I started writing my book about the collapse of the Soviet Union, Autopsy on an Empire, I really had trouble making up my own mind. Is this a good thing or is it a bad thing, what had happened? Even though I had watched very closely the very steps of the way that brought us to that event on December 25, 1991, it nevertheless came as a shock. In many ways, an expected shock, perhaps. And I wrote at the time, my champagne is still corked. I'm not going to celebrate. Now, my attitude was obviously quite different from those of most people who were following things in the United States and, as a matter of fact, elsewhere. And I'm reminded of Bill Safire's characterization of a Bush speech in Kiev, August 1st, 1991, when he recommended that the non-Baltic, non-Russian republics adhere to Gorbachev's Union Treaty. He called it his Chicken Kiev speech. The idea being you were defeatist if you did anything to preserve a union, even a democratic union of 12 Soviet republics. Now, actually, the myth has developed since then, and particularly in Russia, but also elsewhere, including the United States. Oh, we brought down the Soviet Union. That was the end of the Cold War. That's what ended the Cold War. Well, this gets history just absolutely backwards. First of all, the Cold War ended well before the Soviet Union collapsed. Communist rule was brought down from within by Gorbachev, and all of the pressures that brought down the Soviet Union were internal. The United States and most of its allies were trying, with the very little we could do, to help Gorbachev move toward a voluntary federation, with the proviso that we had always considered the three Baltic states as having a right to their independence, and we had never recognized their legal incorporation in the Soviet Union. So our attitude toward independence for the Baltic states and toward movements by others for independence was quite different. Now, some of this has also led to another myth, and that is that we were taken totally by surprise. Did we see what was happening? Frankly, looking back and looking at the records, I think we saw more clearly than perhaps Gorbachev did. Almost certainly we saw more clearly than Gorbachev, because the KGB was feeding him all sorts of fabricated allegations, some of which were just out of thin air, others were simply a distortion. Part of it was to raise his suspicions of the democratic forces, that they were disloyal in various ways, also to diminish his understanding of the power of non-Russian nationalism and various other things. Also undermining trust between, well, there never was much, but whatever possibility of trust there was between Gorbachev and Yeltsin. So all of these things were going on, and yet I was able to send my first message to Washington, pointing out that the Soviet Union could break up and we needed contingency plans for that in July 1990. So that even before then, it was clear in Washington, there was still a prevailing view among many of the analysts that Gorbachev was really trying to strengthen the country to carry out its traditional policies. Now, it was very clear to us, certainly by, I would say, 1988, that that was not the case, that he was going for fundamental reforms. We didn't see how he was going to be successful, but they did seem fundamental. And second, it was not going to make the Soviet Union stronger and a greater threat. And yet, in the first part of the Bush administration, that was the big debate in Washington, particularly among intelligence analysts. Well, but we in the embassy did see what was happening, but on the other hand, the last thing we wanted was a prediction by the CIA that the Soviet Union would break up. That would have brought, if that had happened, it would have leaked, and there would have been a coup against Gorbachev, and there would have been, and if it had happened in 1990 or even early 91, it probably would have been successful. So the idea that you can be, academically totally open with your predictions if you're in the government, and that this will not have an effect on events, is simply a fantasy. So we were very happy that the CIA was not predicting a breakup, because that would have been one of the things that might have prevented, that might have caused a reversion in Soviet policies, foreign and domestic. Now, why was it that we really wanted Gorbachev to succeed? First of all, we didn't want to face a number of new nuclear powers. And of course, when this process started, there were nuclear weapons in more than 4 of the republics. As it turned out, we had to deal with only 4, but that was hard enough. And that was a very immediate concern. But there was a deeper one for those of us who were watching what was going on, and we began to see that the movements were genuine and that they were being pushed from Moscow, and except for the 3 Baltic countries and arguably Georgia, the real democratization was being opposed by the local communist leaders, whether in Belarus or Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan. When I would travel and begin to talk to the embryonic democratic forces, they would make it clear that they existed only because of Moscow's support. So it was clear that if there was going to be a sudden breakup, you were going to have the old system preserved in large areas of the country. Also, many of the splits in Ukraine were over the very democratization. And, of course, when Ukraine went independent, you had, in effect, an unholy alliance between the old apparat and the nationalists from Galicia and the West. And we're still seeing the results of that. So, for all these reasons, we really hoped Gorbachev would succeed. We saw very clearly, however, that he was unlikely to. The economy was in a tailspin. The nationalities were increasingly asserting themselves. We had the beginnings of civil war in Georgia. You already had the beginnings of civil war in Tajikistan. Of course, they had to put down a rebellion in Baku, very serious violence on these fringes. So that it was clear to us that increasingly in 91 that Gorbachev was beleaguered. I would also mention, though I don't have time obviously to go into detail, that if we look at any one of these issues, well, why didn't he recognize this? Why didn't he recognize that? One should realize that in those last 2 or 3 years of the Soviet Union, we were negotiating some of the most portentous, I would say, negotiations that we've ever engaged into. There was the liberation of Eastern Europe, the unification of Germany, the question of NATO membership. There was the Gulf War, where we needed their vote in the United Nations. The START Treaty had not yet been completed until 1991. Conventional Forces Treaty, still in these 2 years. There were all sorts of economic agreements, whether there would be loans for grain or not. We were trying to bring the Soviet Union into the World Copyright Organization. We were negotiating on maritime boundaries. All of these would have been huge issues in and of themselves. At one point, we counted 86 simultaneous international negotiations that were going on while this internal turmoil. So, and one can say, well, why did he miss this? Why did he miss that? And whether you're talking about Bush or about Gorbachev, you would say, good heavens, can you imagine what was on their plate? And the rapidly changing conditions. I would say, however, that among the mistakes that Gorbachev made was that he never really completely trusted the fact that we really wanted him to succeed. This was partly because of disinformation by the KGB, but also he really didn't understand that we were trying to help him. I was just reading Chernyaev's memoirs from 1991, and when Secretary of State Baker invited, or I invited on his behalf, the leaders of the various Union republics to have lunch with him in Moscow, Chernyaev writes that this was a very hostile move and one which showed great arrogance. Well, Bush wanted to get them together to try to persuade them to cooperate with Gorbachev, but they sent out word through the KGB and the party and dissuaded many of them. We got some of the more hostile ones there, and they began to complain about Gorbachev. And Baker said, "Gentlemen, they were all men. I want to remind you, you wouldn't be here today if there were not for Mikhail Gorbachev." And I didn't, come here to hear criticisms of what he's doing. We were trying to help him. Before he went to Kiev, just about 10 days before that, I was called in by the foreign minister, Alexander Besmertny, and said, you know, Gorbachev really doesn't want Bush to go to Kiev. Well, we had already set this up with the Ukrainians. And I said, Sasha, we can't call it off. It'll be all over the papers. It will make this summit a disaster. And he said, well, and I explained. He said, well, I'll go back and try to persuade Gorbachev. And eventually Gorbachev reluctantly said, well, go ahead. Well, that was one of the reasons he made his endorsement, a direct endorsement of the Union Treaty in Kiev. As I said, his whole reason for going there was to tell the others, we want you to stick with Gorbachev. But, you know, there were misunderstandings on both sides, and none was perhaps, again, more characteristic of the fact that on the one hand, Gorbachev was feeling increasingly dependent upon us for support, while at the same time wavering in whether we were supporting and not really understanding what was necessary politically to give him support. And I think he read Yeltsin's visit to Washington in June as something that he wished did not happen. On the other hand, Bush spent his time telling Yeltsin that we expected and wanted Yeltsin to cooperate with Gorbachev. We did not want them to tear the country together, and had Yeltsin tell him, yes, I'm going to cooperate with Gorbachev. And it was also at that meeting that when I had gotten a message from the Moscow mayor that 4 people were leading a conspiracy against Gorbachev, he sent the message to Yeltsin. Yeltsin said, warn Gorbachev. Well, I was asked to go in and warn him, and I didn't name any names, but Gorbachev simply dismissed it. And on a telephone call the next day, Bush let slip the names of that Popov, the mayor of Moscow, had been the one who gave us the names. That, of course, was, I would say, sort of a major breach. On the other hand, looking back, it was clear that Khrushchev, who was organizing this thing, and of course was monitoring these telephone calls, realized he had a leak, and some, including Popov, believe this contributed later to the failure of the coup because he was unable to plan it completely. I cite this only to say how events can have unexpected consequences, totally unweighted one. Accident plays a tremendous role in these things, but these periods, it was one of such great confusion in many respects. I think our leaders handle things pretty well. And I think that what one can say about the breakup of the Soviet Union, whether it was inevitable or not, Steve Cohen thinks it was not inevitable. Many other observers think it was inevitable, if not in 91, at least by 92 or 93. We'll never know. But the fact is that it broke up peacefully as far as the central areas were concerned. It was not a Yugoslavia. And for that, I think we can thank Gorbachev, and I think Russians should give him credit for that. What's happened since, I hope Dr. Kortunov will fill us in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And our last speaker on the panel will be Andrei Kortunov. He is Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council, which is a new organization formed recently with Igor Ivanov. He is the president of the New Eurasia Foundation and Information Scholarship Education Center. He has worked at the Institute of the USA and Canada. He has been an advisor to the Russian government. He's the author of more than 120 publications focused on U.S.-Soviet, U.S.-Russian relations, and also on Russian domestic politics. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Angela. I feel flattered to be here and to be a part of this distinguished panel. though of course it is very difficult to speak after Ambassador Matlock. When he was ambassador to the Soviet Union, I was just a scholar at the Institute of USA and Canada Studies, and though we claim that we played a modest role in promoting the Soviet new political thinking, of course we were not actively involved in the processes which he not only witnessed but also participated to. And I have to say that I cannot pretend to be a sociologist or a student of political science. What we did back in the Soviet Academy of Sciences in the end of 1980s, together with people like Peter Gladkov, who is sitting here, we tried to reform the Russian, or rather the Soviet foreign policy and the Soviet defense posture, which wasn't easy. And of course, at that point, many of us, including some of our bosses, were very naive about the world and about how the Soviet Union could behave in this environment. But let me just focus on one issue, because time is limited, and I understand that we need to leave some time for the discussion. The issue which, in my view, is important, and probably even it is the central issue, at least for me personally. Why does it take so long for Russia to emancipate itself from the Soviet legacy? Can we compare Russia today, let's say, with the American South 20 years after the Civil War? Same emotions, same feeling of frustration, attempts to replay history. Can we say that the Soviet Union is still with us? I think in a number of ways it would be fair to say that the Soviet Union is still alive. Just look at the Russian TV today. Most popular soap operas are about the Soviet Union. Look at the youth fashion. Look at the architecture, the new great style featuring some of the Soviet artifacts. Look at opinion polls. It's not even about Comrade Stalin, which is indicative in itself, but it's about Comrade Brezhnev. And many in Russia now believe that Leonid Brezhnev was indeed the most successful political leader of this country, of our country, during the 20th century. Just, I don't know whether you made a reference of a very indicative remark made by Putin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, who said, stagnation? What is wrong about stagnation? Probably some of you guys who are wealthy and who eat in, these posh Italian places, stagnation is not good. But for ordinary people, stagnation was a major, major positive development. Look at the Soviet industry, look at the Soviet agriculture. Incidentally, he mentioned agriculture. And that was a time of great successes. And let me tell you that it's not just a idle academic who said that, but it is Putin's press secretary. Definitely that reflects something. So in a way, I would say that we are still working on the Soviet legacy. And if someone had asked me 20 years ago, had suggested to me 20 years ago that now in the year 2011 we would still discuss the issue of the Soviet Union, for me that would have been a joke. But indeed, we still live in this past. We still cannot emancipate ourselves from this part. And there should be an explanation for that. I don't pretend that I have an answer to this question, but I'd like to share with you a couple of answers that are being discussed in Russia today. And you can judge for yourselves whether these are valid answers or these are fake answers. The first explanation is probably the most basic, that it's generational. Of course, people who were young during the Soviet days, like my generation, who were full of energy, full of ideas, full of idealism, might feel nostalgic about that. So if this is the case, if it's the case of the Soviet baby boomers, the generation born between, let's say, 1945 and 1960, then, of course, the answer to the question is evident. When this generation fade away, when this generation is replaced by new people, new generations who didn't witness the Soviet Union, the problem will be resolved more or less automatically. I feel rather skeptical about that. I think that it doesn't hold water. First of all, if you look at the Soviet baby boomers, let's say a person who is in his or her 60s now was in his or her 40s when the Soviet Union collapsed. And this person was in his or her 30s when Gorbachev started perestroika. Essentially, this is exactly the generation that brought the Soviet Union down. So why should they change their views, or why should they get so frustrated about reality that they turn back to the Soviet Union? But what is more important is that if you look at the younger generation, and if you look at public opinion polls of those people who got socialized after the Soviet Union collapsed, you'll see that they also feel a lot of sympathy. At least some of them feel a lot of sympathy to the Soviet Union. So, this generational explanation, in my view, is something that does not really explain the affinity, the affection that many people have to the Soviet Union. Let me offer you a different explanation, which is also more or less standard. People tend to believe that the recent development of the Russian Federation is a chain of fortunate or maybe unfortunate accidents. For example, can you imagine that Mr. Yeltsin had chosen another person to become his successor? Not Mr. Putin, but let's say Mr. Nemtsov or Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Or let's put aside the personnel policies of late President Yeltsin. Let's imagine that oil prices were much lower than they actually were over the last 10 years. Would it make a difference? Of course it would make a difference. But again, this explanation does not explain why people turned back to the Soviet Union. Because if the country was even more impoverished than it actually is now, if economic growth was slower, probably the appeal of the Soviet Union, the appeal of the imperial past of the country would be even greater. So definitely Mr. Putin was the right person at the right time to make a change in the development of the Russian Federation. But I think that it would be an overstatement to believe that everything depends just on a single man or on a couple of personnel decisions. I think this is definitely not the case. Restoration as a historic accident, in my view, is not really an explanation. And we should look for something more substantive. Another typical explanation why the Soviet Union is still with us is that basically the Soviet Union is alive primarily because our liberals turned out to be so naive. Our liberals made so many mistakes and blunders, and therefore, against this background, the Soviet Union doesn't look that bad after all. And again, maybe there is something in that, because indeed, the liberal experiment of 1990s was not very successful, to put it mildly. However, I think that in all Central European and East European countries, liberals made many mistakes and blunders. So what? Does it mean that those who came after them didn't make mistakes? Probably not. And besides, liberals are no longer in charge of the country. They are no longer in charge of the country for at least last 10 years. So probably it's not fair to argue that the Soviet Union owes its reputation to mistakes made by liberal reformers. Now let me turn to yet another explanation which is usually made in Moscow. The West. Of course the West is to blame. The West was too slow, too reluctant to embrace the new Russia. The West turned out to be short-sighted. The West turned out to be egotistic. And indeed, the opportunity that existed 20 years ago, the opportunity that existed even 10 years ago, was not used to the extent it should have. Again, I wouldn't say that there is nothing in this line of logic. And let me remind you, for example, when we talk about Mr. Putin and when we criticize the Russian foreign policy of Mr. Putin, I think rightly so, we shouldn't forget that even Putin himself came to power with a clearly defined integrationist foreign policy agenda. If you get back to what was going on between Russia and the West in 2001 or in 2002, you can see that indeed there were opportunities that were not used for a variety of reasons. And probably the West, the United States in particular, has to take a part of responsibility for the chances that were missed. I don't want to go into detail, but I think it's a matter of a special discussion. Why did Putin change the foreign policy in such a profound way in 2003 to 2004? Who was to blame for that? To what extent this change was inevitable? To what extent it could have been avoided? But definitely the outside environment played a role. However, you cannot explain everything appealing to the role of the outside environment. I think that this is something that has to be taken with a grain of salt, because even if Russia had problems with the West, it does not explain why Russia got back to some of the traditional Soviet allies and why the Soviet foreign policy in certain ways was back to the table. Of course, one can argue that the Soviet Union is still with us because of some cultural specificities of the Russian nation. People who believe in that think that basically the Soviet Union was a natural continuation of the Russian cultural and historic tradition, that the Russian society is based on quote-unquote collective values, that the Russian society traditionally has always been paternalistic, and therefore, whether we like it or not, but the Soviet Union in this or that form is likely to be with us in the foreseeable future. Frankly, I don't buy it. I think that the Russian society in the form it existed before the Communist Revolution is no longer there. And therefore, it is very difficult to attribute its features to the current post-communist society that we have in Russia. In a way, Russia is one of the most individualistic societies today, compared with many countries in Western Europe, or even with the society in the United States. Now, as you can see, there are many various ways to explain why the Soviet Union is still there. As far as my personal position is, I do feel that the country is getting ripe for a strong left idea. And that in the absence of this left idea, people tend to get back to the Soviet Union. I do hope that before too long, we will see a strong social democratic party emerging in the country. It will definitely reflect Russian traditions. It will reflect values shared by the majority of the Russian population, and it will reflect the need of social modernization. Economic modernization without social modernization is impossible. And it's not just about the political system, it's about the whole fabric of the society. And this is something which is understood, or at least which is felt, not only by older people, but by the younger generation of Russians. This is something that cannot be faked. You cannot interpret the Russian Communist Party as something that might represent these left values. You cannot buy, this Fair Russia or, Just Russia Party as something that represents these values. We will see when and how this left idea is going to reemerge, but I think that only when this idea takes roots and when we have this idea represented at the highest political level, we can say that the Soviet Union is already history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrei. Before I open this to questions and comments, I'd like to press you a little bit more on the question of generational change, because obviously it's part of conventional wisdom to think that with a younger generation, they're the harbingers of something different. But as you yourself pointed out, if you look at opinion polls and from experience of teaching there and things, at least part of the educated younger generation, they have nostalgia for the Soviet Union as a great power, and for a lot of things. How do you explain this? Is it just a lack of education to make them think differently? Is it what they watch on TV, although most of them use the internet? So how do you explain that?
Well, I have a different explanation. Well, I think that, of course, TV and all this media might be an issue, but I think that it's deeper than that. Unfortunately, in today's Russia, there are a lot of attempts to discourage the younger generation from taking the initiative. And I think the danger, and I sorry if I repeat myself, but I think the real danger is not even political authoritarianism, which is definitely dangerous. The danger is attempts by state, and I have to say quite successful attempts, to get back to the old paternalistic social contract, which would involve not just older people who are used to this contract, but the younger generation. If you look at career preferences of the younger generation, you'll see that younger people would prefer to work as bureaucrats within large state companies, within ministries. They are not ready and not encouraged to take chances and to start their own businesses. So in a way, this is an attempt to sell, this mentality which existed in the Soviet Union for so many years, and which definitely contributed to bringing down the Soviet Union. And my take is that if we're not able to reverse this trend, if we are not able to encourage the younger generation to experiment, to take risks, to start their own businesses, to be less dependent on state, we might lose this generation. And I think that we are already losing people in the age group between 30 and 40 years. It would be
because they're emigrating, right?
Well, some of them are emigrating, some of them become chinovniki, some of them become completely cynical and corrupt, and not too many of them are engaged, let's say, in small business or in innovation. And in my view, this is something that represents a real danger to the future of the country. If you recall, Mikhail Dmitriev presented the findings, and his conclusion was that, Russia has probably the last chance with the demographics. This generation that comes, these people who are in their 20s right now, can still be somehow steered in the right direction, so to say. And I think that this is more than just propaganda, though, of course, propaganda is also important. And plus, there is a kind of romanticism about past, which is, I think, more or less natural. It might be quite superficial. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, the floor is now open for questions, comments, and if you can identify yourself when you ask your question. I think maybe you need to wait for the microphone. Yeah.
My name is Galima Galiulina, Chelyabinsk State University. My question to Ambassador Jack Matlock about the early 90s. You remember this time of shock therapy. Was it possible to help the Russians at this time for Western countries? And what the reasons you see that this help was not happened? And my second question to Andrei Kartunov about the new plan of Putin to organize a common economic space, Eurasian Union. What do you think about this union? Is it the real reflection of people's hopes to build new USSR? Thank you.
Could you give? My hearing aid went out and I didn't understand the question.
I think the question had to do with talking about shock therapy in the early 90s. Is there anything that the West could have done to, am I paraphrasing you right, to sort of get involved in this or to steer Russia maybe in a different direction? Sort of the relationship, I think, of Western policy to the shock therapy.
Some things could have been done differently. I think they should have been tried. Quite frankly, I doubt if they would have made much difference. The problem was simply too great. The problem of changing, particularly the economy, the whole basis of the economy, while you're also changing the whole basis of the political system, and simultaneously redefining one's national identity. These were three profound revolutions that were necessary, and how one, plans to do it better, I don't know. Certainly the United States, in my opinion, should have gotten more involved in discussing the economic transition in '89 and not waited until '91. In fact, one of my recommendations in February '89 was precisely that, and that was the only recommendation that was turned down explicitly at that time. We could have moved more rapidly on some of the arms reduction things, which would have freed up attention for other things. But as far as pouring enough money in '91 to save the system, number one, that was politically impossible in the West. We were going into a slight recession. A second, pouring money into what was still a state system would have been throwing it away. And third, the amount of money necessary. Look at what West Germany spent in the very small area of the former GDR. Billions of Deutsche Marks, and still they haven't been able to bring that area up on a par with the West. The whole Soviet Union was not as well developed as East Germany. There were not enough resources outside, even if there had been the political will, to do it with resources alone. So I think that the idea, and Yeltsin was one who spread this idea, that you could have reform but not on the backs of the Russian people, as he put it, was an absurdity. If you were going to go to a market system, it was going to be very painful. And certainly at times a massive loan and so on might have helped. But on the other hand, if they were unwilling, for example, to index pensions, they were going to be in trouble. And I'm not sure that the lack of foreign loans kept them from indexing pensions. This was when they had this huge inflation in '92. If pensions had been indexed, if they had handled the voucher system in a different way, making the value greater and not allowing sale, but maybe setting up mutual funds, which would be carefully supervised so they didn't become Ponzi schemes. One can think of all sorts of things that could be done better. But I suspect the task was so great, none of them would have worked much better, quite frankly.
Thank you. Andrei, Eurasian Economic Union?
Yes. Well, first of all, speaking of the Putin's publication, my take is that it is a very clear step in his election campaign. Definitely, he understands that a large part of his potential electorate is nostalgic about the Soviet Union, and it would be nice thing to offer, this perspective to the Russian people. Although, I do not exclude that he himself also sincerely believes that that might be one of his major legacies, some kind of restoration. However, you ask whether it is realistic or not. In my view, the question is, what do you have to offer to your partners? If you want to position yourself as a center of a new integration system, you should demonstrate that you are better than any other alternative, right? It means that your economic system should be vibrant and dynamic. Your political system should be flexible and adaptive. The terms that you offer to your neighbors should be attractive. And when the only instrument that you use in dealing with your major partner is energy prices, that's not good enough, in my view. That's not good enough to convince your partners that they should join forces with you and start building a new alliance. So in my view, really the question is whether Putin or whoever it is in charge of this direction of the Russian foreign policy is serious about investing time and effort and political capital into making the Russian system attractive. And so far, it's mostly declaratory. We don't have a comprehensive policy. At least I never heard of any comprehensive policy regarding the Russia's neighbors. It's mostly opportunistic. We'll see. We'll see in a couple of months whether there is anything beyond general declarations.
Okay.
Ina Dubinsky, Voice of America. Unlike many countries, new democracies in Central Europe, Russia was never experiencing the period of lustration. How much of a factor can lustration be in emancipation of Russia from its Soviet past? It's a question to all members of the distinguished panel. Thank you.
Okay. Would you like to start on that?
How much a factor of what?
Lustration.
Oh, lustration.
The fact that Russia hasn't had lustration. Yeah.
Is this working with that?
Yeah. I think it's
Is
all
it
of them
working?
are on.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't think that it would make sense, in the Russian context. I mean, I think that people who committed atrocities in labor camps, that if you can provide proof of this, then they could be brought to trial. But an idea of putting members of a Communist Party on trial, or people who held political office in the Communist Party on trial, I think that makes no sense whatsoever. In fact, it seems to me that the changes, that the people who played the most decisive part in changing the Soviet Union were a section of the party intelligentsia and even a section of the party apparat. People like Chernyayev and Shakhnazarov, who are deputy heads of departments of the Central Committee. Gorbachev himself, of course, party secretary. So, where would you draw the line if you started trying to take legal action against party officials? So I don't think that lack of lustration is the fundamental problem. I mean, if I could say what I think is more of a problem, I think that it's much more that in the last years of the Soviet Union, there was genuine enthusiasm for building democracy. And this enthusiasm was dissipated and lost in the 1990s because people were so disenchanted with what was being constructed and what they were told was democracy. So a lot of Russians said, well, this is democracy, you know what you can do with it. And, we prefer life under Brezhnev to that, this extreme inequality and this giving away our natural resources for a fraction of their true value to a bunch of pre-selected buyers. And I think the West did make a mistake in embracing Russia as a young democracy then. We saw a kleptocracy and called it democracy. And I think that has a lot to do with the failure to develop democracy in Russia today.
Jack. Lustration.
No, I think that was a bad idea because you get all sorts of, you have all sorts of people, and the people with experience, are going to have been in the party. And I think that, I think the situation was really quite different if, say, after Nazi Germany, a much briefer period, and the people who were senior people in the Nazi Party were usually there because they wanted to be. But Soviet Union, for 70 years, the party had run everything, and if you had any responsibility and any experience, you were probably going to be in it. I think it would have been disastrous, just as disastrous as it was in Iraq. And again, a tremendous mistake when they took the people out in the Baath Party, if that's the question.
Okay. Andre.
Well, I have a slightly different view on this, turning point. I think that the real mistake was made back in 1996 when the political class of Russia decided that under no circumstances communists should be back to power, and we will do whatever we need to make sure that Yeltsin is there. It was the first sin, so to say, which later on evolved into a trend and which defied, these democratic principles that emerged earlier under Gorbachev. So I think that it would have been better for the country. It would have been difficult, but it would still be better for the country to see Zyuganov come onto the Kremlin, because that would create a mechanism of power rotation, and that would somehow nail down the principles of democracy, though in the short run that would have had very serious consequences for economic and political reforms.
Cynthia.
Hi, Val Bunce, Cornell University. I have a question first for Andrei Kortunov, and Yugo nostalgia, which is similar to Soviet nostalgia, has certain characteristics, and I would love to hear you say a little bit more about what it is they're missing. In other words, what aspects of the Soviet experiment and experience are they really highlighting here? Because then I think it's a little easier to think about competing explanations. A question for Professor Brown. You have here and elsewhere made, I think, a very powerful case for Gorbachev as a man who learned and changed over the course of when he served in power. But I'm wondering what you think drove that, in part because of what Ambassador Matlock was essentially saying, that in certain ways he did not learn. In certain ways he did not break with a set of Soviet expectations about the role of the West. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about Gorbachev the man and someone who was able to make this transition and why you think that was the case.
Why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Andre. Yeah.
No, I think Gorbachev was actually more comfortable with his Western interlocutors than with almost everyone else. I think he often spoke more frankly to his Western interlocutors, including Brandt, Gonzalez, people like that. Even Margaret Thatcher. He was telling Margaret Thatcher in 1987 that, the Politburo was divided, and she assured him the British cabinet was as well. He did feel reasonably comfortable with them. But to go back to something that Ambassador Matlock was saying, that the United States is wanting to help. But, if you look, the United States administration spoke with a number of different voices, and the voice of reason, I think, was represented by Jack Matlock and George Shultz. But, even people like Scowcroft, until very late in the day were suspicious of Gorbachev. And Gorbachev's speech at the United Nations in December 1988, which Shultz described as ideologically ending the Cold War, Scowcroft regarded it as very dangerous for the United States and a tremendous propaganda thing, and don't take seriously what he said about cutting the armed forces. So I think, and then again, as Ambassador Matlock said, that the KGB were feeding him information, the most pessimistic account of what the West was trying to do. But I think that when any time Gorbachev could himself be in direct contact with Western leaders, he learned a lot from them. I mean, he told the Politburo that even though he disagreed with so much Margaret Thatcher said, he realized what Soviet policy looked like through West European eyes, you know, after she spoke in typically frank fashion about how it seemed to her. And equally, he learned from his meetings with Schulz. But above all, he was on the same wavelength as the West European Social Democrats. And so I think that, yeah, there was a remarkably fast evolution of his views to a position which became almost indistinguishable from that of West European Social Democrats.
Andre?
Well, you know, first of all, of course, speaking of the Soviet Union, we're talking about a rather complex and protracted phenomenon. Some like the Soviet Union of 1980s, some like the Soviet Union of 1930s, and these are two very different countries. So it's difficult to generalize. But let me say, first of all, what they do not feel about the Soviet Union. And it's not about stability anymore, because we have stability in Russia, and still people are no longer ready, at least many of them are not longer ready to buy it at the listed price. It's not about prosperity, because I think on the average right now, the Russians are probably more affluent than they were during the Soviet period. And it's not about democracy, of course, because the Soviet Union could not qualify as a democratic country. So what is it about? I think, first of all, and again, you know, I tend to be very personal here. Maybe, you know, you might have different views on that. I think, first of all, it's the sense of fairness. Yeah. The Soviet Union, with all the limitations, with all the constraints, was a fair society. Mm-hmm. Russia today is not a fair society. Some are very rich, some are poor, people steal and get away with that. There is a profound sense of the society being unfair. And I think that this is important. The second thing which is missing today, and which they seem to find in the Soviet past, is the sense of a common cause. Right? So there was something that united all of us, something that transcended ethnic divisions or social divisions. The Soviet Union was an egalitarian state, and with all the, again, reservations we might have, this notion invented by Yakovlev of the new historic entity of people, there was something in that. There were certain bonds and certain similarities and something that kept all these people together. And you can find these nostalgic feelings not just in the Russian Federation, but elsewhere as well. Out of a sudden, you know, this common cause was lost, and these boundaries emerged, and people still, you know, watch these old Soviet movies, and they feel, you know, this is something we understand, this is something we can have a sense of. This is our common past, and why don't we have a common future? And finally, I think that, again, you can say that it is superficial, but I think that they are looking for self-esteem, which they find in the Soviet Union, and which they do not find in contemporary Russia. When they watch media, you look, you know, follow Russian media and newspapers, they see that a lot of, you know, muckrakers, a lot of naughty stories about Russians, about the Russian quote-unquote political elite. And there is a kind of romantic feeling that, you know, we were a great country with some moral standards, which gave us a sense of self-esteem and self-respect, which we lost over time. So that's how I would approach that. But again, you know, I definitely do not claim that it's the only interpretation that you might have.
I just want to ask you a question on this fairness. But surely people knew in the Soviet times that the nomenklatura had their own stores, their own clinics, that they had all kinds of privileges. I mean, there wasn't the internet and therefore... But, people understood this. I mean, it wasn't a fair society then. Are you saying it was more fair, right?
Well,
the discrepancies weren't so great.
Yeah, let me say that, I can only... reiterate what has been said here is that one of the major driving forces of perestroika was egalitarianism. And when Yeltsin emerged as a political figure, he fought against privileges. He didn't fight for democracy. He fought against privileges. And of course, at that point, one of the major deficiencies of late socialism, late Soviet Union, was that it started to deviate from the principles of fairness, which were perceived as fundamental principles of the Soviet Union. When they talk about Stalin, for example, one of the most commonly used ideas or images of Stalin. Look here, he didn't have anything actually of his own. He lived in a very modest environment. He didn't have any property, no bank accounts abroad, no friends like Berlusconi. So basically, the point is that Comrade Stalin was a modest person, and it was fair in the sense, at least how people understood fairness. But now, when they look back to late Soviet Union under Brezhnev, for them, of course, even with all the deviations, the Soviet Union of the Brezhnev time was still much more fair compared to contemporary Russia. Probably it was a little bit more hypocritical, but at least, the party nomenclatura had to hide its wealth and its conspicuous consumption.
Thanks. Okay. Yes, Steve.
So, at the risk of being along the same lines, I have a question both for Professor Brown and for Professor Kortunov. First, for Professor Brown, I was wondering how you would describe or explain Gorbachev's conduct right after the August coup and the return from Foros. So this is one of the moments when people on the other side of this debate say, clearly, Mikhail Sergeyevich never quite changed, because why at that moment would you say, for example, that you wanted to preserve the Communist Party, even in a new form, rather than, for example, say, this is my moment to found a new Social Democratic Party, which would have indeed received a lot of support at that point, and even go further and talk about Lenin's ideas about the creative power of the masses being proven by the failure of the August coup. So I'm wondering how you interpret his thinking and decision-making. Was that strategic only? Did it reflect some deeper belief, confusion? And for Andrei, so just to continue the debate a little bit, I mean, one explanation you didn't mention in your excellent speech, which I found so interesting, is just what Weber used to call Machtprestige. I mean, countries that go through these kinds of geopolitical downfalls often have this phenomenon. So there was a Bismarck cult, in Weimar, Germany, and people made pilgrimages to his home and talked about how great it was to have Bismarck leading the German foreign policy effort. You have the Napoleon III in French history, who creates the Second Empire and even invades Mexico to try to show you can be just as good as the original Bonaparte. And those are regimes that had some serious or either regimes or movements that had serious social support. So I'm wondering if Russia is really so distinct in this way, or whether that 20-year period of kind of nostalgia is actually quite par for the course.
Yeah, Archie.
Yes, well, I think that some of Gorbachev's statements just immediately after the coup were among the least profitable political statements he ever made. I think the charitable explanation would be that he was extremely tired. He'd not had much sleep during that time. I think to go back to the beginning, it was extremely important that he told these people where to go when they came and asked him to hand over their powers temporarily, as they lyingly told him. And Varenikov later complained to the people investigating him that Gorbachev had used unparliamentary language in telling them where to go. So that was good for him. But when he came back and spoke about the party and so on, that was a tactical error. He'd already been speaking with his aides, with his close colleagues, about splitting the party, and the plan was to hold a party congress in November that year at which the party would split. Earlier, Shakhtazarov had told him that he should in 1990 split the party. He was always a bit wary about doing this because, I mean, historically splitters came out badly in the Soviet Union, and it was a huge risk. This might have brought forward the date of the coup. We don't know. And if as Jack Matlock said, if the coup had taken place earlier, for example, before Yeltsin had the legitimacy of having been popularly elected president of Russia, it would have had a higher chance of success, especially if it had taken place on a cold January night and it would be harder for 200,000 people to stand around the White House. So he hesitated, but he was definitely intending to split the party and lead a social democratic rump of the party from November that year. But yes, what he said immediately after the coup was undoubtedly mistaken, and it did him a lot of damage. And if anyone else has got a better explanation, I'd like to hear it, but I assume that he was dead tired and he wasn't thinking straight.
A very human explanation.
I think definitely this explanation deserves consideration. I would still distinguish between two periods of the Soviet Union. If you're looking back to find something really glorious and something really great, you should probably look at the period of Stalin and the Second World War and things like that. However, Brezhnev can hardly qualify as Napoleon or even Bismarck. So I think that, and so there are different types of appeal here, and many those who are nostalgic about the last period of the Soviet Union probably do not think about this imperial might, but rather a period they feel comfortable about this Brezhnev's period. Though again, I agree with your general point that it might be some post-imperial syndrome which is still with us.
Yes, in the back.
Yes, I'm Pat Harahan, a military historian, retired. I had a question about the consequences of 1991. How did the Russian government change over the next 20 years? We know, for example, in the area of military, that they reduced their nuclear weapons under treaty by 75%. We know they reduced their conventional weapons. But what other changes were major quasi-permanent changes in the government of Russia over the last 20 years?
Is that directed against anyone particular? Would you like to?
Andrei, I think.
I thought it was the changes in the Russian government? Or?
Right, or maybe it's
Yeah,
after
I think-
Andrei. Right. When in doubt, ask Andrei.
Well, of course, if you take foreign policy of the Russian Federation, the major difference with the Soviet Union is that no longer there is an ideological conflict. One can say that there are still geopolitical disagreements and problems between Russia and the West, but definitely the ideological conflict is gone. And in a way that creates this, very strange, I would say even schizophrenic policies of the Russian Federation, because if you look at the inertia, and the inertia is still there, it drives the Russian Federation in the direction of the old Soviet policy. If you look at the specific interests and the absence of the ideological conflict, it drives the Russian foreign policy in an absolutely different direction. But you mentioned, the reductions in the Russian conventional and nuclear arsenal. I think these are important changes. However, these changes also demonstrate limitations of this change, because even the last agreement between Russia and the United States on strategic arms is an agreement which sticks to the logic, to the pattern of the Cold War. We are still talking about mutual assured deterrence, about the second strike capability, about unacceptable damage, about all these things that were invented in the early 1960s by McNamara and his team, which shows that Russia has not changed dramatically in terms of its relations with the West and in its relations with this country. So we're not talking about burden sharing with the United States in the nuclear field or in the conventional field. We are still in the business of balancing, which in my view is one of the major limitations of the change. And unless we are able to go beyond that, unless we are able to change the pattern of our relations with the West, unless we start thinking about ourselves as a part of this whole larger Western system, I think that any rapprochement will have its clear limits. And I'm afraid this is what we see right now.
Over here.
Peter Gladkov. I'm now with the Intergovernmental Foundation for Cultural, Scientific and Educational Cooperation of the CIS countries. I would like to, instead of question, I would like to make a comment that goes in line with the discussion of the last days of the Soviet Union, and mainly with the famous or infamous Belovezhskaya Pusha Treaty. As a matter of fact, this summer, our foundation was, we were lucky, together with the Russian embassy in the Ukraine, to get together all living participants to this event. On a very low-profile format, we were able to bring together Mr. Shushkevich, Mr. Leonid Kravchuk, even Leonid Kuchma participated just after he was interrogated by the general prosecutor of the Ukraine.
Yeah.
And on the Russian side, Naina Yeltsina, Tatiana Yumasheva, Valentin Yumashev, and Gennady Burbulis participated. And since it was a very rather low-profile event, people were very sincere during the discussion. And the major lesson that I draw from this discussion was that actually nobody at that time of all those signatories of this treaty was ready and for what would come out of this treaty. Nobody foresaw what is going to happen with this treaty, because the major idea was to have some kind of a rather close confederation of the states. And it was very interesting, a very interesting topic was raised by the mastermind under this whole event, Gennady Burbulis, who was talking about how those discussions about the future relationship between those countries will evolve. And it actually, the major thing, the major lesson that we can draw, that it just happened. It just happened. People they were not prepared for it. But unfortunately, or fortunately, it depends on the angle, the internal logic of the political developments of the countries, the internal struggles of the elites that were struggling for their places under the sun, brought about this further and further disruption of those countries that that ended in a rather peculiar situation now, which is actually, I think, also an issue to discuss itself.
Thank you. That's a very interesting comment. So can one conclude from that, from what you've said, that the main reason for the meeting was to get rid of Gorbachev, to make sure that he didn't have a country to rule anymore, and that the rest of it wasn't well thought out?
Well, actually, you are right, though nobody mentioned that. Nobody mentioned that.
Okay.
That's it. Though, Mr. Well, that's okay. I'll give the floor to other people because I was going to talk about the vision of Mr. Gorbachev and about since we were talking about the visions of those people. Actually, just a few words about that.
Oh, please.
Actually, the major problem, I think, the political problem of the Soviet Union in the 20th century was that no political leader of the Soviet Union had any vision of what should be coming with this country, with the exception of probably one of them that would better had no vision, actually, I think. And Gorbachev, unfortunately, didn't know what he wanted. And Andrei Kortunov and we participated 2 years ago, I think, in Venice in a conference held by Gorbachev Foundation on this issue of the disruption of the Soviet Union, so on and so forth. And it has so happened that Gorbachev, after 20 years, he didn't learn anything. He still has this mixture of ideas of communism, socialism, democratic socialism, libertarianism, whatever. And he just could not formulate, even at that time, what was he at that time. And that was his problem. And this is the problem of the present government of Russia, and of Putin, of course. Because Putin, when he came to power, he had no vision, absolutely. Now he is trying to present this vision as a recreation of some kind of a quasi-Soviet Union on the basis of this Eurasian Union or trade treaty or whatever. We'll see whether it is a just election, whatever, gimmick, or it is his real vision, or he wants to enter into the history as a man who reunited the country that he liked a lot.
Okay. All right. Ambassador Matlock, please. Yes.
Just briefly, and I know Professor Brown has even more to say on this, let me say that I do think Gorbachev knew what he wanted. What he didn't know, and no one else knew, is how to get there. Now, what he wanted obviously changed and developed. So you can't say that something he said in 85 or 86 or even 87 was what he believed in 89 or in 91. His ideas, as I think the ideas of any truly intelligent person, were influenced by events. And when things didn't work out, he would change. I don't consider that a matter for criticism. I would like to see that in more leaders, who instead of simply defending the same thing in the same theory that isn't working, who look for different ways. He did, and I'll just conclude by saying at least from 90 and 91 and maybe as early as 89, I'd have to check my notes, he would say in private, this is a country that has always been ruled top-down. Successful countries today are ruled bottom-up. My task is turning Russian history upside down. But I can't do it overnight, and I cannot reinvent the Russian people or their history. At the present, they don't know how to rule themselves because they've never given the opportunity. Give us time. I think that was a very profound understanding of what had to be done. Now, when you start out with something that revolutionary, as I mentioned, it involves revolutions in 3 profound areas. No one knows what would have worked. No one at that time did. It had to be trial and error. Anyway, let me stop and let Professor Brown give you a more profound...
I think we can have another 2 hours on this. Yes, please.
I'm very much on the same wavelength as Jack Matlock in this. Ryzhkov in his memoir said that Gorbachev was a leader of a parliamentary type, and God knows how this had happened, he said, because he rose through the party apparatus. But nevertheless, he was somebody who listened, and he changed his views over time. He did evolve, as Jack has said, and as I tried to argue earlier, into a social democrat. This is a coherent position. Look at Norway today. The United Nations Development Agency ranked Norway as the best country in the world in which to live, and all sorts of criteria, life expectancy, level of education, health service, you name it. This is a viable alternative to the kind of capitalism that has been built in Russia and to the communism which Gorbachev ultimately rejected. So I regard that as an entirely coherent position. I mentioned that the party program in 1991, it's scarcely read because it seemed irrelevant. The Soviet Union was collapsing, but nevertheless it represents a coherent position. It's Gorbachev's position. It wasn't that of the apparat. They had no intention of implementing it. A lot of them were already planning the coup. But ideationally he did develop, and so I think he did have alternative ideas, but they were never fully implemented. On the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was very interesting what you said about that. But the lead-up had been going on for a long time, and I remember Shakhnazarov saying to me that it was a desperate blow to the Union when Yeltsin in 1990 said that Russian law has supremacy over Soviet law. It was one thing for Estonia to say that. A union could have survived, but for Russia to say that, this made it very difficult indeed. And if I can just add that Andrei Kartunov was speaking about nostalgia for the Soviet Union. In the current issue of Problems of Post-Communism, Anders Oslund accuses me of having a nostalgia for the Soviet Union. And I think what is absolutely decisive for me is if a union can be held together on a democratic basis, why should we say that an ever smaller, vociferous unit should be better? Within every so-called nation state, there is another nation. Look at Georgia today, ready to break away. So this can be a process of infinite egress. So what matters is, can you hold something together democratically? My own country, Britain, in 10 years from now may not exist. It's possible. I would say there's a 40% chance of the breakup of Britain. And I, as a Scot, would vote for keeping Britain. But about 40% of Scots want to break it up. So the issue is, can you hold together a country by consent, democratically, not the size of the union? This is very commonly misunderstood.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for a couple of questions. Yes, you had your hand up in the back. Lady there.
Hi, Linda Park, Association for Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies. My first question is for Andrei Kartunov. Well, maybe it's a comment. It seems to me that, we're talking about nostalgia of the Soviet legacy, but it's really more about their vision of the future, right? I think that's one of the reasons why younger people can have a nostalgia for a Brezhnev era that they didn't live through, because it's really their vision of the future. So I just wanted to kind of raise that issue. And my second question perhaps is for the entire panel, and I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to sort of project forward and ask you whether you actually see an emergence of social democratic movement coming out of Russia anytime soon. Do you actually see them take the road that was not taken back in 91?
Okay, maybe we start with Andrea.
Well, I think you're right, and indeed, I think it's something which explains the current moods in Russia. My problem with that is that, of course, we might be all nostalgic about something, and this country might be nostalgic about 1950s or 1960s. But I think that the point is that we still have to think about the future, not only about the past. And if we are looking for role models, if we are looking for ideal, social arrangements in the past without thinking about the future, it puts us into a rather precarious situation. So I think that Russia does have to turn the page. It does have to start a new chapter in its history. And I think that it has to come to grips with its past, which is not easy. But unless we do that, it will always be with us and will always block our future development. So we have to do it. Let historians argue, but let's make sure that, no matter how great or how humble our past was, it shouldn't prevent us from moving ahead. I think this is important.
You want to talk about, do you see a sort of social democratic movement arising, developing anytime soon?
In Russia.
In Russia, yeah.
I think it's very difficult to predict. I was often asked around 89, 90, 91, what's going to happen to us? And my answer was, I really don't know. Of course, when it happens, it'll be easier to explain why it was inevitable. Now, I do think that, frankly, some combination of free market and government participation as a yardstick, as a rule maker, is going to be necessary for every society. Whether you call it quasi-socialism, social democracy, or market economy with a human face, or whatever, it's going to be a mixture of what is, say, the purer theoretical concepts of socialism and capitalism. You need elements of both, in my opinion, and we're all fighting within us over how you develop that. I think I don't know how our own fight in the United States is going to come out, and so I certainly couldn't predict how it is in Russia. But I do feel that the most effective systems are those who mix qualities of both, and that societies have different areas of tolerance. Americans will tolerate much less direct governmental intervention, but you'll certainly see a great resistance, as we are now, to cutting it out entirely. And so I think what the problem is too many of our intellectuals simply think in theoretical terms rather than in pragmatic terms. And I would hope both countries can go back to a larger dose of pragmatism.
Well, I was very encouraged by what Andrei Kortunov said, that he felt that there was a base for social democracy in Russia today. I've felt that there should be. I mean, if you look at what people want, they want some kind of welfare state. They do want free and fair elections, and they want all the attributes of democracy. But it's been totally absent. And so in a sense, it's a mystery why social democratic parties have been totally unsuccessful in the post-Soviet period. Well, now, of course, the system is so managed from above, and you've got sort of pseudo parties being set up. It makes it very difficult for a genuine party even to enter the political process. That there are various ways of keeping them out. But if the popular demand is sufficiently strong, then a party should emerge from below. And I do feel that there was in the last years of the Soviet Union, there was a chance of such a party emerging. And so in that sense, the fact that the Soviet Union broke up in the way it did and when it did was unfortunate. If it could have been held together, or the greater part of it held together on a voluntary basis, then such a party would have had a greater chance of emerging. It's also, I think, worth noting that the prevailing ideas at the time were those of Thatcher Reagan, if you like, a belief that the less states, the better. And in fact, we've seen recently that totally unregulated markets are not such a brilliant idea after all. I mean, Gorbachev was mocked when he said that he wanted a regulated market economy. The people said, what kind of idiot is this? Thinks you can have a market economy that's regulated. Well, leave them to their own devices and we get into another kind of mess.
Right, I think we have time for one more question. We'll have that. And then when you answer it, if you also want to make any final summary remarks.
Tanyel Kushakjian from the Armenian Assembly. I was hoping you could share your views on the South Caucasus during the 1988 to 91 period, the independence movements of the peoples from Nagorno-Karabakh to South Ossetia, and the Russian response. Thank you.
All right, well, we'll start with you.
The Armenian case, it always reminds me of Ireland, Northern Ireland. It's the kind of case where whatever the British government did, the Unionists in Northern Ireland and the Catholics in Northern Ireland would think, that the British government was on the other side. Eventually, after decades of turmoil and deaths, they got a settlement. And I think Nagorno-Karabakh was very much like that. Gorbachev had a terrible dilemma. I mean, as Jack Matlock said, that the number of items on his agenda was horrendous. Every problem that had been sat upon and repressed for 70 years had come to the surface of political life, including Nagorno-Karabakh. Again, he was trying to get a settlement that both sides could agree on. But the Azeris said, look at people like Agan Bigyan, Shakhnazarov, people of Armenian origin in his entourage. So of course, he's on the side of the Armenians. Then in Armenia, there were many people who thought that he was leaning towards Azerbaijan. So it was another of these almost insoluble issues for politicians in Moscow. And when Primakov was sent there, this again was an attempt to be even-handed. In fact, I think this is the first time that Armenian radio could be received and in Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenian television, rather. So, the position of Armenians there definitely improved. And as for Georgia, it was predictable that when Georgia became an independent state, that the position of their minorities would become more acute because they felt more comfortable in the Soviet Union than being ruled from Tbilisi. So I think what it illustrates is that ever smaller national units are not necessarily the answer, and the task is to get people to live together on the basis of democracy and tolerance. It's extremely difficult.
Jack?
I think one of the great failures of the international system in the last 20 years has been an inability to define responsibilities for minority groups, and particularly those who under one system had at least a degree of autonomy, and what is the obligation of the successor regime. And unfortunately, we've found the West operating one set of principles in the Balkans and how we treated Kosovo, and Russia using that example in the case of Georgia, and the same. There are more similarities than differences, though of course there are differences in these situations, and we simply have not sorted out how the international community should, and international law applies to autonomies that are being abolished or minorities that are being somehow put upon and resist. We get it in a different form, of course, in the Middle East, repeated many and many again. I would just say that I think it has not been handled well up to now. I don't think there is a hero in the group. I think all parties have tended to act rather badly. Maybe we're on the way to solving it in the Balkans, and maybe not. But certainly the South Caucasus is one which the situation, I believe, is not currently in Russia's interest. I think Russia would have been much better served by doing their best to maintain the territorial integrity of the South Caucasus ones and maintaining contacts, rather than carrying over many of the ideas of the past and worrying about Western influence and all of these things that caused, I think, reactions that are quite negative. Situation now is that Russia has a very unsettled border in the Caucasus and tremendous difficulty, and I don't see how it's going to quiet down until Russia has good relations with all three of the South Caucasus countries, and until we find some solution to this problem of the enclaves and the minorities. I'm afraid that's not going to happen.
Andre?
Well, speaking of the Caucasus, I think that one of the problems that Russia faces is that traditionally, over the last couple of years at least, they tried to separate problems of North Caucasus from the problems of South Caucasus. And of course, North Caucasus remains one of the central problems for the Russian Federation. And now we see the limitations of the strategy that was designed and implemented in the region over the last years, that it reached the limits of its efficiency. In my view, the only way to go beyond the current strategy is to approach Caucasus as an integrated system, which will not be easy. But if this broader approach is accepted, I think many issues will become more, clearly defined, including some issues that separate Russia from its neighbors to the south of the Caucasian mountainous chain.
I apologize to those who didn't get to ask questions. As you can see, this panel has provoked lots of interest, so please join me in thanking our panelists for a very stimulating discussion.